That's what I thought. That's what I wanted to know.
Or in Purim.
Yeah, because Purim is
I
also
say
day.
December 30. People wait till the last minute.
Never had that issue.
Well, I paid up.
Get more stuff at the end of the year just to get it in.
No, I paid up the Agura.
Oh,
My cheshbon, all the money that I owe to Tzedakah, I might as well pay it now because I benefited from it right away.
right. Hey, you don't
If
have
I
to
pay
wait
it tomorrow, then I have to wait a whole year to benefit from it. Zok the Gemara. Echad Kodshim
wait
Ksher.
more than- Oh, you
I saw something very scary yesterday. There was someone from Antwerp that was approached somebody for money. He was raising money for a kollel. And someone told me, you're coming to me from Antwerp to raise money for a kollel? Why can't Antwerp support their own kollel? He said in Antwerp it's very hard to raise money for tzedakah because nothing is tax deductible. Tzedakah is not tax deductible in Antwerp. That makes it very hard.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it's kosher or pasul, as long as it's shayah psulin b'kodesh. If it was psulin b'kodesh, means the psul happened after the zrika, it will be chayiv for shchutei chutz, v'krivim b'chutz chayiv. And Rashi tells us why. Because hoyle b'fnimim olu lo yerdu. We learned that if the psul happened b'kodesh, then even though you're not supposed to put it on the mizbeach, but if you do place it on the mizbeach, taloch is lo yerdu. So therefore, miskabel b'fnim karinabei. We consider this miskabel b'fnim, and anything that's miskabel b'fnim, you're chayiv v'chayav nalei b'chutz. Gewaltig. Zogt gemar weiter. Hamayla kezayis min ha'oila umin ha'emur b'chutz chayiv. What if you took a kezayis, you did not have a kezayis of basar, nor did you have a kezayis of emur, but if you combined together the half a kezayis of the basar and the half a kezayis of emurin, you would have a full kezayis. B'chutz will be chayiv. Why? The kula kol. Because by the oila, it doesn't matter. By the shlomim, it would matter. Because what's eaten by the bailam doesn't go on the mizbeach. It's not oila the mizbeach. But by the oila, even the meat is destined for the mizbeach. And therefore, if it's put on the mizbeach b'chutz, it's going to be chayiv for shchutei chutz. Taner Rabbanan. It says in the pasuk, "V'aleim taimar ishish mi beis Yisrael munager sheyoger v'soicham asher yala oila oizavach." What's the oila oizavach? Mainly ala oila minayin l'rabas emurei osham. Remember, we're saying the emurim, the part that belong on the mizbeach. The emurei chatos, the emurei kochi kochim, the emurei kodeshim kalim. Talmud loymar zavach. The zavach includes all korbanos. Minayin l'rabas hakoymetz, which is not a zevach, right? It's the kemitza of the mincha. V'alavoina, which is part of what's brought along with the mincha. V'aketayris, and the ketayris. Uminchas kohanim, and the mincha v'koyin, which is kolil, the whole mincha is placed on the mizbeach. So it's roy lahala. Uminchas koyin mishiach, which is the daily mincha that the Kohen Gadol brought, v'hamanasech shloishes lugin yain, or if someone is menasech 3 lugin of wine, which is the smallest amount of nische yain you could have, u'shloishes lugin mayim, which again, we're talking about what type of water, b'chag on sukkos ka'amar, u'v'mekdosh l'chag. Of course, we're not just talking about any water. We're talking about the water that was set aside to be poured on the mizbeach. Because stam pouring water on the mizbeach outside, there's no issue. That's not called shchutei chutz. The definition of shchutei chutz is to take something that's supposed to be put on the mizbeach, in the azara, and putting it on the mizbeach out of the azara. Talmud loimer ve'al pesach oil moed lo yivienu. Not only a zevach, anything that's supposed to be brought to the oil moed and is not, there is a chiyuv kares. Kol abala pesach oil moed chayovin lo b'chutz. I would only know Kadeshim Ksherim. Now we're going to know the reason for our Mishnah. Minayin l'rabis psulim. How do you know that even if it's possible and you're not supposed to place it on the mizbeach, but if it's merely im alu l'yerdu, that would be enough to say that there's a chiyuv kares to be ma'alit b'chutz. What are examples of psulim where we would say him olu lo yerdu? Halon, if it was left overnight, v'hayoytze, or if it left azara, which by definition it always is going to be, if you're being ma'ileh b'chutz, v'atame, or if it was tame, or v'shenishchat chutz l'zmani b'chutz l'mkoymoi, or if it was shechted with a machshav of pigol, or v'shekiblu psulin v'zar kros damai, or if a apostle was makabelit, or if a apostle bedrika, or v'anitin lamata shenostan lamayla, if you had a carbon that the dam was supposed to be spritzed on the lower half of the mizbeach, and you spritzed the blood on the upper half of the mizbeach, or v'anitin lamayla shenostan lamata, or v'anitin b'chutz shenostan b'fnim, v'anitin b'fnim shenostan b'chutz. B'fnim and b'chutz, meaning the mizbeach ha'pnimi or the mizbeach ha'chitzon, u'pesach v'chatos, and the pesach and the chatos, shenosnon shaloi l'shma, that were shaloi l'shma. Remember, the very first Mishnah in our Masechta says that the only two karbanos that are possible if they're shaloi l'shma is the pesach and the chatos. Minayin, how do you know that all these psulim, if someone was ma'ila them b'chutz, how do we know that there's a chivkaris? Talmud Lomer lo yivienu la'asois. We learn it from the word la'asois. As Rashi says, Talmud Lomer la'asois, mashma ha'ru'uyin la'asois. Afilu einay royu lovay mechutz lefnim. If it's right to be put on the mizbeach, even though it's not l'chadchila supposed to be brought from chutz lefnim because it's possible already, but alu lo yerdu. V'hani nami kivin alu lo yerdu. Since if they would be placed on the mizbeach wrongfully, we would leave them on the mizbeach. And once they're on the mizbeach, you don't just put it on the mizbeach and ignore it. The koyin niskak lehafek bahen mitzinoira. Once something's on the mizbeach, even though it's a apostle, we say alu lo yerdu, the kohanim attending to the fire on the mizbeach have to treat it like any other meat that belongs there, and poke around with their sticks to make sure it's burning well. Or if it was just sitting at the top of the mizbeach, but it's not in the flame, the kohanim have to put it into the flame. That's called Ru'uyin Layasas Karinabay. That means it's supposed to be dealt with. It belongs on the Mizbeach. It's royal Mizbeach, and therefore there will be a chiyuv kares of shluchut echutz. Kol miskabel b'Pesach Hamoed Chayaven Olav b'chutz, which is the halacha of our Mishnah. Zok the Heilige Gemara weiter. Hamayla kezayis min ha'oila, and they murim together. Zok the Gemara, oila the emureha in, because they're both placed on the mizbech. But shlamim the emurehim lie. But of course, it wouldn't apply to shlamim, as Rashi says. Shlamim ein b'sarin mitzaref im emureim lekazayis halos chutz. Mishum the basar shlamim lav bar haktarah. The basar shlamim does not belong on the mizbech, made to be eaten by the bailam. V'lekarina bay al pasach oil moed lo yivienu. Tanina lo the Tanur. We have a brayso that says the same thing. Oila ve'emureha mistarfen lechazayis la loisen b'chutz lagabe the iser of shchut echutz ulechayev alayen mishum pigol noiser v'tameh. So what does it mean that davka the oila, not the shlomim, are the emurim mistaref to the basar to be mechayev olav mishum pigol noiser v'tameh? If I had shlomim that was pigol, and I ate a half a kazayis of emurin and a half a kazayis of the basar, are you going to tell me that it wouldn't be chayiv? I understand why it's not mitzvah for the gabe chutz, because the gabe chutz is only something that's royal mizbech. But the gabe isher pigol, the brayso seems to be saying that if you ate from a shlomim that was pigol, and the halach is you chayiv korosh if you eat the basar of a shlomim that's pigol, but you didn't eat the kazayis of basar, you didn't eat the kazayis of emur, and you ate half and half. It's mashra dafka by the oila that's mitzvah, not by the shlomim. The same thing would be with noiser and with tameh. So Rashi, kasokadaitoch be'oichel kazayis basar ve'emurin me'oilas pigol noiser b'tumas agofachlei. Right? That's the pashas what's talked about. So frank the Gemara, b'shloma halos oila the kolil in shlomim loy. I understand why the Rashi makes that distinction between the oila and the shlomim legabe the iser of Allah b'chutz, because you're not Chayav for a law b'chutz only on something that goes on the mizbeach, not the basar. Ela pigel v'noisa v'tamei my timer. Why in the world wouldn't they be mitzaref legabe kazayis of pigel or kazayis of noiser or kazayis of tamei? But now we learn kol hapigulim mitzarfen, v'chol noiser mitzarfen. Kasha pigel apigel, kasha noiser and noiser. Zokt Rashi. My time will mitzaref not mi basar shlomim memurav lepigel v'noiser v'tamei. Habein bebasar. Bein Murin, Shaykh Pigel Noiser V'Tamei. The problem of Pigel Noiser and Tamei apply equally by the Basar as it does to the Murin. Kidam Rina Perk Beishami, the whole Sheyesh Le Matirin. Anything that has Matirin, this is a good chazara for us. Anything that you need A to be done to release B, such as you need the Zrika to be done to release the Basar to the Bailim or to the Kohanim, and they murim to the Mizbeach. The Chosh Yesh LeMatirin, Bein LaAdam, Bein LeMizbeach, there Chayav and Allah Mishum Pigel. Remember, we said that the koimet itself, you're not chayav if you eat it, even though it's Pigel, because that's not a Davar Yesh LeMatirin. The koimet is matir the rest of the mincha, but the kamit, right? So the kamit itself is not the Davar Yesh LeMatirin. It is the matir. So if you eat the rest of the mincha, you're chayav al Pigel. But if you eat the meat itself, you wouldn't have a problem. So the basar and the murin are both called a davar hanitar. Utnanami hasa dvarim she'ein chayavna leim mishum pigel. What are you not chayav on pigel for? Like we mentioned earlier, or valavayna, because that's also the representative of the mincha that's put onto the mizbeach to be matir the rest of the mincha. Vakatayris she'ein leim matirin elahein atzman. Matirin, they are the matir. Excuse me. They will have a chi of noiser and tamei. V'chol shekain a murin shapigel noig behen. Surely a murin that pigel applies to it. And you learn it out of psukim. So for the Gemara, kasha pigel a pigel and kasha noiser a noiser. Zokt Gemara pigel a pigel like kasha. We're not talking about, the Bryce is not talking about when you had pigel already, and the question is, will a kazayis of basar be mitzaref to kazayis of emurim? Because avada will be, can't be pigel. By pigel avada it will be mitzaref, but can be machshavas pigel. By machshavas pigel, there the basar and the emurim are not going to be mitzaref. What does that mean, Dr. Rashi? Kam b'pigel, kam b'machshavas pigel. Hada katani mitzarfin. Where do we taste mitzaref? V'eichel pigel kamer, like we just said, l'us chayav chatas. Avada, since the murin have it in pigel and the basar is in pigel, if you had half a kazayis of each one, you chayav for eating a kazayis of pigel. But v'hada katani oila in shalomim loy, that's a b'machshavas pigel when you're originally making it pigel. And what does that mean? Shem shachat oizarat. If you did the shchita or the zrika, almanas lahaktir chatzi zayis basar oila, the chatzi zayis me'emurin chutlas manei would be pickle. What if someone said, I'm shechting almanas, not to be makriv a kazayis of basar of the oila, chutlas manei, only half a kazayis, not to be makriv a kazayis of emurin chutlas manei, only half. So the half a kazayis that you had kavana to be makriv chutlas manei of basar will be mitzaref with the half a kazayis of a murin that you had kavana to be makriv by the oila, because by the oila we consider the emurin and the basar one and the same because they're both put onto the mizbech. Avol b'shlomim chishiv lechoil oila haktir chatzi zayis basar the chatzi zayis emurin that's like pigel. Kasai you didn't have a kazayis of basar lachila in mind to eat chutz manai, and so you didn't have in mind to be maktir a kazayis of emurim chutz manai. So you're karech mikan shein machshavas achila b'niktarin. The machshava achila does not apply to niktarin. Vein machshava aktara b'nechol, and the word aktara doesn't pass for nechol. So therefore, this would not become pigel. That's what we're saying when we're contrasting oila to a shlomim lagabe pigel is lagabe the machshavas pigel. The same with noiser and noiser like kasha. This is a very interesting chiddush we're about to learn. Kan b'noiser regular noiser avada it's mitzaref. Avada, a half a kazayis of noiser of basar, with a half a kazayis of noiser of a murin are mitzaref. And if you ate it, you're chay of chorus, even by a shlum. Where it's not mitzaref is kan b'sheni toisru ad shaloi nizur kadam. If it became noiser before this rika sadam, umani Rabbi Yeshua, it's going according to Rabbi Yeshua, who said, the Tanya Rabbi Yeshua Omer, kol hazvachin shebetoira, shenishtar ben kezayis basar, oi kezayis. It's not ukazayis, it's oi kezayis. We just had this Rabbi Yeshua the last couple of days. Oi kezayis chaylev zerk esadam. Remember we had something about basar badam. What's the lashon pasuk? It says in the pasuk, Im basar ein dam, im dam ein basar. If there is nothing for the dam to be matir, then you don't make this rika at all. If you remember, we had a shaila, do you make this rika legabe? We had a shaila, if you will make this rika legabe, maybe the nesachim, legabe the minach. We'll discuss that later. But if there's no basar and there's no emurin, then there's no din zrika. So therefore, so if you have either a kazayis of chaylev or a kazayis of basar, then zarek asadam. But if you have chatzizayis basar, the chatzizayis chaylev ain't a zarek asadam. But if you have chatzizayis basar, the chatzizayis chaylev zarek asadam pnei shekulei kol. So let's go back. So how does it explain it over here? So where lagabe noiser, if there was not a full kazayis of either basar left over, or at least a full kazayis of imurim left over, there's no din zrika. So what does that have to do with noiser? There's no din zrika. The zrika will be possible. So this is where we have an important link that Rashi teaches us. Kan ben noiser, kan b'sheni toishu at shalon yizukadam. How the katani mitzarfin is ba'oichel noiser kamer. That's Pasha. What the katani oila in shlomim loy is b'sheni toishu mei ibud. There was noiser. But the noiser was in a case where there was no basar or no emurin for this rikas adam to be chalapa. So b'shenitaysher may ibud or usreifel, or if the meat went missing or if the meat got burnt, to go in avdu habasar. Let's say there's no basar left. Ve'emurin, there's no emurin left. Koydem zrika, but v'nishtaer chatzi zayis mizeh v'chatzi zayis mizeh. There was a half a kazayis of emurin left over, and a half a kazayis of basar left over. Will that satisfy Rabbi Yeshua's requirement of a sisoy lesecha basar badam? But oila the kula kalu, by oila, which is all kalil, it will be satisfied. Have a zrikas dam zrika. It would be a good zrika. You have a full kazayis of a chilas mizbeach. Uchid Rabbi Yeshua dam of a perik fil yoim imein basar and dam. The chivan de zrika he chayav nalav mishum noiser. If it's a good zrika, then there's a din noiser. So here Rashi tells us another very important chiddush. Basar will not become possible because of noiser unless it had a proper zrika dam. If there's no proper zrika dam, it never becomes noiser. That's the chiddush that we have. How do you know that? So we're going to see that in a moment. Even things that you won't be chayav for on pigel, chayavin mishum noiser. Right? And we just had that in the previous Rashi, going kaimet shochilas mizbech koila. The matir could never become osir al pigel, but the matir could become posel al noiser. The choshkein devarim shechayavin alam mishum pigel, surely things that are davar hanitar, which will even be subject to the isha pigel, going basar oila. Avol shlomim, by a shlomim ein chati zayis vibesaron, the chati zayis me'emurayhen, mitzarfin liyoi shir, lizrak alayim esadam, to qualify this rika. You know why? The lav achilas odamika, the lav achilas from his be'achika. It's nishta hair. So therefore, this rika is not a qualified rika. The kivin that I have is rika. Therefore, im zorak, even if you made this rika based on a half a kazayis of basar and a half a kazayis of a murin of a carbon shlomim, ein chayavin alei mishum noishe v'tomei. You won't be chayiv if you eat this meat, half a kazayis and half a kazayis. You won't be chayiv if you eat it when it's nicer, and you won't be chayiv if you eat it when you were tummy. Why? Where do you know that from? The kaimalon kol hanitar litahirin chayavin alav mishum tumah. The only time you'll be mechuyev if you eat something betuma is if it could have been eaten to someone who was Torah. And we learn noiseh from Tumah. So therefore, if it's not nitul Torah, which is not, you're not chayiv mishum Tumah. Once you're not chayiv mishum Tumah, because of a zereshav of chilul, you're not chayiv mishum noiser. So therefore, if there was no kosher rika, because you didn't have a full kazayis of basar or full kazayis of a murin, there's no din Tumah and there's no din noiser, and that's what we're talking about here in the Brisa. What about if I left Azara? The Amar, if he holds that the Zrika will help with the Yaitse, then you'd say the same thing. If the Zrika doesn't work for something, then there will be no Chiv if you ate it when it was nicer, and there would be no Chiv if you ate it when you were told. So now we have a Pashup shot on the Brisa. So now we know that if you don't have Basar or a murin, the zrika is not good. What about a mincha? Umincha afilu kula kayemes lo yisra. The mincha, even if it's all intact, you don't spritz. What do you spritz by a mincha? Mincha maya vidta. Who's talking about spritzing? It's a mincha. Amar Papa minchas nesachim haba min hazebach. By the mincha, even though it's kula kayemes, that wouldn't be enough to say you can make zrika. You can only make zrika if you have a murin or if you have basar. You might say, okay, not only the word basar, but at least let me be matter the mincha to be brought. The mincha that normally accompanies the carbon, the mincha won't do it. Davke, even though it's part of the carbon, being matter the mincha is not enough to qualify this rika. As Rashi says, the avad basar azavach. So what happened was before this rika, the meat of the zavach went missing. But the mincha kayemes, but the mincha is still around. Lo yizuk asadam b'shvila the lav gufa de zevchahu. It's an accessory to the zevach. It's not the zevach itself. It will not meet the threshold that Rabbi Shua requires of a sisa iloisecha habasar bada. Zok tehelig mishnah b'iter hakaymet the kmitza itself v'alavoina the haktara v'aketaris and the ketaris. Now, what ketaris are we talking about? Rashi says we're talking about the Ketarish Bechol Yoim, where it's pras b'shachris or pras bein harbayim. That might come into question a little bit later. Or minchas kaihanim, which is a mincha that a kohen brings, which is kulei kolel. Or minchas kohen mishiach, which is the mincha that the kohen gadol brings every day, which is actually a bigger mincha than that of the kohen. Or minchas nesachim, or the minchas nesachim, which is the mincha that would normally accompany a carbon. Shehikriv me'eched mehen kazayis b'chutz. A kazayis of any one of these karbonis were put on the mizbech b'chutz chayiv. Now we know the halacha is there's no kazayis of these karbonis. These karbonis all need to go on the mizbech b'pnim. Nevertheless, even if you didn't put the whole carbon b'chutz, you only put a kazayis, it would be enough to be mechayiv you. Rabbi Lezer pointer at sheyakriv eskulim. Rabbi Lezer says, no, unless you do what you do b'fnim, that you do b'chutz, which is kulei kolil, you're not over al shchutei chutz. Let's see Rashi. There's a long Rashi, but a very important Rashi. Sheik the gazayis men b'chutz chayiv. Kasavar, the Gemara, the Mishnah holds over here. Now this is relevant to what we learned yesterday. If you remember yesterday, it was a little bit complex, but we had a machloikis if you were Maila, and in your Chayzu were Maila, Chayzu were Maila. We had a Machloikis, are you Chayiv Achas, or you Chayiv multiples? And we had 4 ways yesterday to understand the Machloikis. There was Rabbi Yochanan, there was Rish Lakish, and there were 2 Lashonos and Ula. And the Gemara said that the second Lashon of Ula is the same as Rabbi Yochanan, so there were really only 3 Mahalchim. So let's just do a quick Chazorah of those Mahalchim, because they weren't, it was a little bit complicated. So the first shot of the Machloikus was, we know that when it comes to the Isra b'Hallah b'chutz, you have to do a complete Hallah. It says, it has to be done to completion. But the question is, what does it mean to completion? Does it mean the whole animal? If it means the whole animal, so then it makes perfect sense why we have a Shita who holds, that if you Ramala a little bit, and then a little bit, and then a little bit, you only chayv once. Why you only chayv once? Because the din of halal b'chutz is only mechayiv yikaris if you do the whole animal. So no matter how many times it took you to get the whole animal onto the mizbeach, when you get the whole animal onto your mizbeach b'chutz, that's when you're chayiv once. The other sheet holds no. Every aver individually has a chiyuv of halah b'chutz. So therefore, hamalav 3 times. Well, you were over 3 times because you brought up 3 avar. That was the first machlokes. According to that shot in the machlokes, everybody would agree that if you just took up a kazayas, you for sure would be chayiv. You either have to take up the whole animal to be mechuyev, or you have to take up a full aver. And then we had the second way to learn the machlokes was according to Rish Lakish, and that was that avada you don't have to bring up the full animal, but maybe you have to bring up the full aver. And the question was if you were missing a part of the aver. And then the shaila was, would there be a chiyuv for that due to the fact that you find sometimes even a davar chaser you put up. But there's no shita yesterday who learned that if it's less than a kazayis, you would be, or even a kazayis would be enough. So that's what Rashi's dealing with. How does this stem with the discussion we had yesterday? So Zokt Rashi, Kasavar our Mishnah holds, Kiksiv Oisai, meaning Allah Shalai Muchayev, Veinachayev Allah Chaser, when the Torah says it has to be a complete item, right? It definitely can't mean the whole animal because that wouldn't stem over here. Here we're saying even the kazayis is going to be good. And it doesn't have to be a whole limb either, because once again, there's only a kazayis over here. Our Mishnah holds Ashir Haktar Ksiv Hainu Kazayis. It means it has to be a full Shir Haktar, which does not stem with the Pshat that we looked yesterday. Rabbi Eliezer Nami. Now, what does Rabbi Eliezer hold? He says Poiter Achi Yaakov is Kulam, but he only says it by Kaimates Levayna Haktorah. Rabbi Eliezer didn't argue in the first Mishnah, which says that even a kazayas of oila you'll be chayav for a lo b'chutz. How come he's moed over there? That means he must also be moed that a kazayas is enough. So Rabbi Eliezer Nami midaloi polag areishak of the oila, it must be he agrees that by the oila kazayas is enough to be mechayiv you al tamayla b'chutz. Hachanami darish lei oisoi ashir haktorah karbonon. He must agree that a kazayas, a minimal shir haktorah would be enough to be mechayiv somebody for a lo b'chutz. Umiu oila the loy mivsala b'chisaroin. The oila, which it would be kosher anyway, the chol atma bedam tuluya kaparasa chay b'kazayis. By the oila, even if there was no more meat around, the carbon would still be affected. Because once you spritz the dam of the oila, the bilim is all, it's a little bilim l'shem chayva, and the oila accomplished what it had to, even if no meat gets onto the midbeach. Therefore, he holds that the minimal amount of meat, even a kazayis, would be mechayiv al talah b'chutz, because once the zrika is done, it's going to be a kosher or carbon anyway. Aval bahani, but the items listed in our Mishnah, where when it's done properly, the entirety of the carbon has to be put on the mizbeach. There is where Rabbi Eliezer argues. The kasavar koimetz kule hainu shirak terasai. The shirak Torah, even bifnim, is not a kazayis. The entire koimetz has to go up onto mizbeach. The mitzvah b'chisaron. If you didn't put up the entire koimetz, it would be possible. And you know what? The Rabbanan Amaida. Everybody agrees if the entire koimetz isn't placed on the mizbeach, the carbon is possible. So therefore, Zokt Rabbi Eliezer, if you have to be maktir the entire koimetz to be a kosher Torah, if it was done b'fnim properly, well then in order to be chayiv al talah b'chutz, it would also have to be the entire one. So because hainu shirak terasei af b'fnim the hamivsal b'chesaret. If you didn't place the entire koimetz on the mizbeach properly, it wouldn't be fulfilled the carbon. V'chein kulam, and the same thing applies to the levayna, to klarish, and all those other things. Shekulam atir nein v'chozman shaloi karvu kulam loy havak Torah lotzes bayim dechivasan. So of course you have to do what you would need to do b'fnim is what you have to do b'chutz. Putting a little sampling doesn't cut it. So what's part of the Rabbanan? L'Rabbanan b'fnim nami. He's the sheet is the word b'fnim. B'fnim nami havya hakdarasam b'kazayis. In fact, even b'fnim the haktara is enough to have a kazayis. You have to be makir the entire koimet and the entire carbon, but the minimum share is kazayis. What does that mean? Yes, you have to put it all in the mizbeach. But you don't have to put it all in the mizbeach in one shot. You could put a kazais, put another kazais, as long as at the end of the day you have the full koimitz there, and it's eventually all going to get onto the mizbeach. A kazais at a time would be good enough. So you see, a kazais is considered a haktara. Utanan hikter kaimta pamayim ksheira. Even if you have to be makti the koimitz multiple times because you did it in bits and pieces, it would still be kosher. Hilchach haktari, therefore it's considered haktara. So they both agree that the entirety of these carbons, in order to be mekayim the mitzvah b'fnim, have to be put on the mizbeach. And they both agree that if you put it in bit by bit, it would be enough. But lagabi, being overall talah b'chutz, Rebbe Lezer holds it's got to be the whole carbon b'chutz, not just a little bit, because that's what would be required b'fnim. But Rabbanon, since you could do it little by little, so if you did a little bit, as long as it was a gazais b'chutz, you would also be chayiv al shchutei chutz. V'kulan, all of these items listed here, shekrivan b'fnim, if you were makri them b'fnim, but v'shayir mehen kazayis, but you were missing one kazayis, which is necessary to be makri b'fnim, to fulfill the carbon b'fnim, but that last kazayis, instead of putting it where it belongs b'fnim, v'kriva b'chutz, chayiv, because that was the final clincher to be matri the carbon, you were supposed to put it b'fnim and you put it b'chutz. V'chulun shechosh v'koldu, and if you were missing some, v'kriva b'chutz, it would be potter, because kula alma maida, that would not be a good akra. Hamakriv, hamayla kachim ve'murin b'chutz, you will be chayiv. Let's hear Rashi. V'chulun shechosh v'kolshu, kaidem aktara. If before the aktara, some of it were missing, either ayidei ibud or shreifa, nifslu b'chesrainon, the carbon becomes possible. Kedarminim b'menachas min amincha, prat l'shechasra, l'shechasra he l'shechasra kamta. So therefore, since it's not going to be a kosher or carbon anymore, you don't have a, you're missing a part, you're not going to be over al talabachos. Tana Rabban, hamaktir kezayis b'chutz chayiv, you're going to be chayiv. Chatzi pras bifnim, but then it's going to be potter. What do you mean if you're makriv a chatzi pras bifnim? First of all, you're supposed to be makriv bifnim. So what potter does it make sense? If anything, you say chatzi pras bifnim, it's a kosher carbon, not a kosher carbon, but chayiv or potter is only applicable to when there's an isser involved. You're doing it bifnim. My potter, it means potter zor. If a zor was only maktir half of the ketairis, which is not the full shear, he will be potter because he didn't do a haktara, and therefore he won't be chayav. Correct, Gemara, but why would he be potter? Amai haktara, it's still a haktara, so why would he be potter for it? Zot Rashi. If I can find the Gemara. V'amai potter haktari, the hahai tana the k'mechayiv Allah b'chutz. We just said a moment ago that if you were makter kazayis b'chutz chayiv, so if it's enough to be mechayiv you al ta'ala b'chutz, so then shouldn't it be mechayiv you as a zor if you did it b'fnim? Amar b'zeir, Amar b'chist, Amar b'yirmi ba'aba Amar Rav. My potter, it means potter tzibur. It means if you were makter ketairis, not all of it, just part of it, but it's kazayis, it would be enough to be Yosy the tzibur yudei chevason. As Rashi says, my potter tzibur, the Yosy yudei chevason, the kazayis have a hatar. Even though you only remarked your kazayis at the ketairis, not all that was required, but if a kazayis is done, there we will say that the tzibur was Yosy. That's what potter means. Amar Abzayr, if you want to ask a kasha on this brisa, there is a problem. Ha-kashali, this is what's fair. Because Rav commented on this brisa. Had Amar Rav Allah, but ha afilu Rabbi Eliezer moida. Here, even Rabbi Eliezer would be moida. Here, even Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah, who says poiter achi yaker v'skulam, he will be moida that a pater is the cheaper. Now Rabbi Eliezer says beferish, it's not considered a haktara unless you put everything on the mizbeach b'chutz. So how could Rabbi Eliezer be moida that a makti kazayis b'chutz chayiv? Rabbi Eliezer beferish in our Mishnah said not like that. So Rabbi Eliezer la vaktari he kamar. So how could Rav say on this brisa that Rabbi Eliezer is moida? He's mefurish not moida He says before in the Mishnah that a kazayis of these items placed b'chutz is not enough. It has to be the full amount. Zok to Gemara, Omar Rava explains. The Haktar the Heichel, the daily Ktaris that you're makter in the Heichel on the Mizbeach Apnimi, there a kazayis is enough. There you don't have to bedavka put on the exact right amount. Because there's no meforisha amount. It says prosper biker or prosper nearbyim. It doesn't give it. The Torah is not specific with the precise amount. So therefore, kazayis would be enough to be mighty. So back Torah the hechal the chul amaloi pligi. Everybody agrees it will be kosher. Keep pligi. You know where Rabbi Eliezer addresses our Mishnah by Ketairis and says Poiter Achiyaker v'Skulan. That's the Torah the fnim. That's the Torah on Yom Kippur of the Torahs, where it says the Kohen has to take Miloi Chavnav. The Torah is very specific with the amount of Torahs he has to be makir. So there's Rabbi Eliezer. If you only took a kazayis of that, and you were makir b'chutz, you won't be chayiv. If you just took a kazayis of regular daily Torahs, Avad Rabbi Eliezer holds you be chayiv. Where does Rabbi Eliezer say you're potter if you took only a kazayis of the Ketairis on Yom Kippur? So now the Ketairis in our Mishnah no longer means the regular daily Ketairis. It means Davka the Ketairis on Erev Yom Kippur. But the Brisa, where after the relations Moida, that a Kazayis B'chutz will be Chayiv, will be speaking about the daily Ketairis. Keep ligi b'aktor b'fnim. The Marasav or Maloi Chafnov Davka. Rabbi Eliezer says, the Torah says on Yom Kippur it's Maloi Chafnov, and if you don't do Maloi Chafnov, you didn't do what has to be done. Umar Maloi Chafnov is Lav Davka. There is no specific shir for Yom Kippur either. So that could be the machlokes, the Rabbanon and Rabbi Yosy in Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer says even the kazayis, even on Yom Kippur, would be enough on Yom Kippur to be matir or to be yoytze the mitzvah of ketairis, and Rabbi Eliezer it wouldn't be enough. Amar le Abaye, how could you say that? V'kika ksiva chuka b'aktorah defnimuduksev. How could you tell me that the Rabbanon in our Mishnah hold that Meloi Chafnav is Lav Davka? By Yom Kippur, the Pasuk says, V'oisa zois lachem l'chuka soilam. And we know that when it says l'chuka soilam, it means you have to follow the instructions to the T, or else you're not yoytze. So how could you suggest that the Rabbanon would hold that even the kazayis of Ketairis on Yom Kippur would work? Ela Amar Abaye, so Abaye disagrees. And he says, Ba'aktar b'fnim kula amalei polik, lepligi. Everybody agrees that the Aktar b'fnim requires a full amount, and even the Rabbanon would be moida that if only a kazayis of the Ketairis of Yom Kippur was put b'chutz, there would be no chi of kares there. Keep ligi, the machlokes in our Mishnah is b'Aktar the chutz. Marsav or yalfin and pnim chutz. Rabbi Eliezer lords, just like by pnim, there's a specific amount, and if you didn't do the full amount, that wouldn't be chayiv al talah b'chutz. So too, b'chutz as well, it will be the same thing. Marasavar lo yalfin. No, davka b'fnim, that's where it has to be, but not chutz. I might have typed that wrong, so let's have a quick look at Rashi. Marasavar yalfin pnim chutz. Yalfin k'tar shel pnim miktar shel heichal. So I typed it wrong. Ma'aktar shel heichal b'chutz is b'kazayis. Avaktar shel pnim chayavan olah b'bama b'kazayis. So what we're saying is kul al moida on Yom Kippur to be yoytze, you have to put the full amount. But just because to be yoytze you have to put the full amount, how much would you have to put b'chutz to be chayiv? So just like the Torahs of every day, where even b'fnim kazayis is enough, and therefore kazayis b'chutz will be enough to create an Israel on the chiv kares, so too the Torah Yom Kippur. Even though we agree that in order for you to be yoytze b'fnim, it has to be the full amount, but maybe the chiv of halah b'chutz would still be on the kazayis, and that could be the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Chacham in our Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer says, "What are you talking about? If b'fnim you need a whole amount, b'chutz you need a full amount." The Rabban said, no, even though b'fnim you need a full amount, but b'chutz it should be like the liktaris, where even the kazayis would create the chiv kares. So ma'ashav yafin pnim michutz, which the Chacham hold, you learn pnim michutz, and just like by the chutz, a kazayis brought b'chutz, you would be chayiv. So too, the Torah belongs in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. If a kazayis of it was brought outside, it would be chayiv kares. says, Amar Rava, Zok Rava, this doesn't make sense. Because what are you telling me? You're telling me that the Rabbanon say that even though the Ketorah Shebifnim, in order to be Yosy, needs the full amount, but Lagabe Halo B'chutz, only a Kazayis will ask you. That doesn't make sense. Because Hashta Chutz Michutz Lo Yalfi Rabbanon. The Rabbanon don't even learn Chutz Chutz. Peneme Chutz Miboy, Mai. What do you mean they don't learn Chutz Michutz? Titanya, Yochel Hamay Lepachas Mikazayis. Koimitz, upachas mikazayis emurid, which are all things that are bechutz, not lefnai v'lefnim. V'manasech pachas mishloishes lugan yain, or pachas migimel lugan mayim. Yechayiv, you might think it'll be chayiv. Talmud loimer lasois ala shalem chayiv ve'ene chayiv ala chaser. You only chayiv for the complete amount. That means if you don't have a full 3 lugan of yain or a full 3 lugan of water, that would not be chayiv al shchutei chutz. The others we said as a kazayis is enough, right? We said that the koymitz a kazayis is enough. But pachas nushloish lugin the isbu kamazaisim. Pachas nushloish lugin mayim could still be 20 kazaisim. How come you don't learn chutz michutz and say just like a kazayis of a mincha would have been enough, so too a kazayis of the nesachim would be enough? You don't. So you're going to tell me that chutz miptim you're going to learn. You're going to learn, and you're going to even give him chorus for being maila kazayis b'chutz of the Ketorah of Kippur. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. You see clearly that you don't learn one from the other, and the full shear is what you need. El Amar Rava, you know what the case is? Kigoyin de kavinu shnei chatzoi b'mona. The case was where you had both halves enough for the full amount in a keli together. As Rashi says, we're not speaking about the pnim. We're speaking about the heichel, the daily requirement. Where kazayis will be enough. And the reason that's why it's chayiv. That's why it says in the Brayso you're chayiv with a kazayis, because a kazayis would be enough for the regular daily keteris. Rabbi Elazar moida b'kedera, and Rabbi Elazar moida that a kazayis would be chayiv. But what's the case of the Mishnah where Rabbi Elazar says it's only the full amount that's mechayiv you and not a kazayis? They're both in the same keli. They're in one keli together, and Mar Savar Kaviyas Mona Milsi, the fact that they're in the keli together now binds them and says that you have to be makir the whole thing b'chutz in order to be mechayiv. Umar Savar Lav Milsi, Zok Rashi, because Savar Belozer Kaviyas the Mona Milsi, Hoyel v'nosen Shnei Chatzoi Pras b'klei Aktaris Eichel, since you had the 2 kazaisim, the full amount was in the same keli, Kavei Mona. That the keli makes it into one unit, and therefore vichaser kol shu mifsal. Therefore, hilchach b'chutz loy mechayiv atshakavus kula. When you say a kazayis is enough, if you have a kazayis by itself, but if you have the full amount in a keli, then you can't do half. So it's speaking where you have the full amount in a keli. That's where Rabbi Elazar says you have to be makab the whole amount of nim to be chayiv, to be yoytzei, and therefore you have to be makab the full amount of chutz to be chayiv. The Rabbanan know the fact that they're in the same keli does not do anything, and nevertheless still a kazayis is enough, and therefore a kazayis alone that you were makab b'chutz will be mechayiv you. Even though we have only a couple on to the 2 dots, we're going to have to stop here. Is tomorrow holiday schedule? Tomorrow's back to regular business. Regular business.